Hi, I am Dr. Neil Cox from University of Reading, and this is the first in 3 very short talks on Frankenstein. And my interest in these talks, at least at the beginning, is with the narrative frame of the novel. It does that classic Gothic thing, doesn't it, of a kind of a story within a story. We've got that kind of nested narration we see in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Dracula, in Henry James's Turn of the Screw. And I just want to explore it a little bit and draw out just the weirdness of it, really. Here's a paragraph, and I've put it down the bottom of this video for you to read, from near the beginning of the novel, when Wharton has discovered Victor Frankenstein frozen in the ice. He's kind of thawed him out, and Victor's promised to tell the tale of how he ended up in this sorry condition, and Wharton's really excited to hear it, and is writing all this to his sister. And this is what he writes. He, that's Frankenstein, then told me that he would commence his narrative the next day when I should be at leisure. This promise drew from me the warmest thanks. I've resolved every night, when I'm not imperatively occupied by my duties, to record as nearly as possible in his own words what he has related during the day. If I should be engaged, I'll at least make notes. This manuscript will doubtless afford you the greatest pleasure, but to me, who know him, and who hear it from his own lips, with what interest and sympathy shall I read it in some future day? Even now, as I commence my task, his full-toned voice swells in my ears, his lustrous eyes dwell on me with all their melancholy sweetness. I see his thin hand raised in animation, while the lineaments of his face are radiated by the soul within. Strange and harrowing must be his story. Frightful the storm which embraced the gallant vessel on its course and wrecked it thus. Well, in one sense, a really simple opposition is being set up here, I think, between the idea of hearing a story and reading a story. The manuscript is going to probably afford the sister, according to Wharton, great pleasure when she reads it. But she doesn't really know Victor. Wharton, on the other hand, can actually hear his voice, and it's a full-toned voice. There's something complete about that sound. It doesn't lack. It's not distanced in that way. And it swells in my ears. There's something internal and intimate about this voice. And it's swelling in the ears, even now. Again, something present and immediate, right now, is where this is happening. But to see this actually simply as setting up an opposition between a kind of a present and immediate hearing and a later reading is kind of problematic when you look at it. That kind of lack, which seems in one sense to be situated with the sister, actually keeps returning to that Wharton's own experience, I think, of hearing Frankenstein. You can start thinking about this actually by worrying the idea of starting things or beginning. He then told me he would commence his narrative the next day when I should be at leisure. So the narrative has yet to begin. There's something odd about that anyway, isn't there? He then told me that he would commence his narrative. It's like, I'm going to tell you a story in a minute. Well, haven't you already begun telling a story? The idea of announcing that you're going to commence a narrative, it sets up the problem of what you're doing precisely at the moment. And in a novel like Frankenstein, which begins with this kind of framing narrative that in some sense isn't part of the central tale, that idea of an initial framing of a story yet to come is it's kind of interesting because it's kind of in miniature what's going to happen in the text in general. But I see something else more obviously problematic here, that he then told me that he would commence his narrative. And then as we read down, even now as I commence my task, his full-toned voice swells in my ears. What is this the, in one sense I think this is just the idea that this is the bit before his narrative commences. That Wharton's just listening to him go on about how he's going to commence his narrative the next day, and that's the voice that's swelling in his ears. But there's also the idea that, this now is about commencing my task, that somehow the task has already begun, that we are now at the beginning of the story in some way. It's difficult to know exactly where we are. And if the writing of this narrative, which I'll point out in a minute, does indeed seem to be subsequent to the hearing. What does it mean for the hearing and the writing to be there at the same time? But actually, if we dig down a little bit further, things get really probably strange. Yeah. This manuscript will doubtless afford you the greatest pleasure. But to me, who know him and who hear it from his own lips, what interest and sympathy shall I read it in a future day? Well, what is the it that that Wharton hears from Victor's own lips? Well, if you read that sentence, the it is the manuscript. The manuscript is something that will afford you great pleasure. But it's also the thing that I'm hearing from his own lips. Why is that important? Well, Wharton here is narrating the whole process of how the manuscript is going to be created. I've resolved every night, when I'm not imperatively occupied by my duties, to record as near as possible in his own words what is related during the day. If I should be engaged, I will at least make notes. In other words, writing and producing what will be the manuscript is not about an absolute fidelity to that full-toned voice. It's as accurate as possible. Writing and producing the manuscript, as Wharton imagines it, is about falling short of capturing the story and the voice in all its present entirety. What then does it mean to suggest that the manuscript, which remember hasn't even been created yet, is to be heard from his own lips? The manuscript is absolutely opposed to the voice in one sense, because it's the end result of a process that moves away from the voice and can't quite capture it. Yet it is also at the site of the voice itself. Seemingly, the manuscript that's going to be created is so accurate, it basically is what is being heard. And all of that actually just points to something else that's so odd about this. And that is, there is a strange kind of nostalgia for the future here. Wharton actually isn't spending most of his time saying, oh, I love hearing this story, I love this guy's full-tone voice. He's actually saying, you're going to get great pleasure from this story, when you read the manuscript. But me, I'm going to really, really gain sympathy from it. It's going to be amazing when I read it. In years to come, it's going to just rock. It's going to be fantastic. So actually what Wharton is praising here is not his immediate experience of listening, but the idea that that experience is going to produce a manuscript which then he can read later. It's not about an immediate listening, it's a fantasy of a future reading. that he is setting himself up as the future reader of his own text. Instead of a simple opposition between present listening and future reading, there is a promise of a kind of a future reading that will have something of the presence of an immediate listening. Yet even as that is insisted upon, there is a split, there is a difference. We know that writing and speaking, listening and reading aren't the same things. What we've got here is, I think, a couple of things. The first is this whole narrative is set up to involve something that's irreducibly absent. Warden's own narration says, unless you are there, there's always going to be something lacking in this text. You're never really going to sympathise, you're never really going to understand. The text is constructing a notion of lack. But there's also a kind of a lack, I think, readable in terms of impossibility. That this is setting up oppositions, but in such a way that they are both absolute iron and separated, yet also within that process fall into each other. And easy separations of things can't quite be maintained, and the result is a kind of impossible narration.